Hi, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Polish Institute for International Affairs for having us. I started off in journalism 21 years ago. Is this better? The very first article I ever wrote, which I believe was in 2001, was about Poland's considering buying F-16s from the United States, preparing for something that at the time seemed very theoretical, but 2 decades later is very real for us. So I wanted to start off with the first question for Michael. Can you provide an assessment of both Russian and Ukrainian military on the ground in Ukraine and where we are right now?
So honestly, in 5 minutes, no, but I'll try to do the question justice. Caveats up front that there's a lot we still don't really know about this war, and it's still quite early on, and there's a lot of discoveries being made. I think the biggest question that's still out there about the Russian military is to what extent this is really a bad army or a terrible plan. It's clearly to some extent both. A good army can compensate for poor political strategy or poor military strategy to an extent. The Russian military is clearly not that army. But all that being said, the Russian scheme to conduct quick regime change, to essentially try to overthrow the government of Ukraine, not expecting a fight, not organizing much for a sustained fight, not telling their troops, was very deterministic of the early part of the effort. And the first phase of the war was really the decisive phase. The first 3 weeks, and arguably maybe even the very first 4 days. One of the biggest things I think we've learned about the Russian military is that fundamentally they can't scale military operations to a theater campaign. And that's something you actually really cannot tell about a military. Militaries can move battalions together, maybe some brigades, conduct a limited operation, do expeditionary operations alongside a much larger coalition ally. The Russian military hadn't attempted something like this in many decades, and a lot of the things that they had done on smaller scale or tried to show in exercises, they couldn't execute and they couldn't do on a larger scale. And at this stage, the Russian military is trying to fight this war at peacetime war strength. They've taken tremendous levels of attrition, and fundamentally they can't sustain this conflict with the military they currently have. Now, they have options. I don't want to broad brush categorize this, but at the level of attrition they had, the war is just not sustainable for the Russian military with the current strength they're fighting with. The Russian military also made big choices on force structure, big assumptions that panned out very wrong for them, and I think we've learned a lot about the actual quality of Russian troops in terms of training, leadership, and big challenges that they've always had, and then they never really fixed in terms of military culture and organization and discipline. At this stage, the offensive in the Donbass really increasingly looks like Russia's last offensive in this war, at least for now. And the reason I say that is because Russia's offensive potential is likely to be exhausted in the coming weeks. That's the truth. They're running out of troops and they have a real manpower issue, fundamentally. Ukraine has mobilized a tremendous amount of manpower with access to Western equipment, ammunition, and the like. They can turn that into combat credible forces over time. They can replace losses. They can generate reserve units. And so the general trajectory in the war, at least the military balance at this stage, favors Ukraine. That's a fair overall assessment. That's not necessarily an assessment of what's happening in the local fight in the Donbass right now. But I think that's the big picture takeaway. That said, despite the fact that the Russian military may be running out of offensive potential, it doesn't mean that it's going to easily melt away. It has not faced significant routs, it has faced defeats and retreats, and the war could go on. Russia has options to sustain this war, even if it is a strategic defeat by all appearances for Russia. Maybe I'll conclude on these 2 points. Based on poor Russian performance in the first phase, and I think a very lackluster performance in the second phase, we've definitely learned a great deal about the Russian military, or at least we think we have. I'm going to couch that by saying the initial takes on wars are often wrong. You have to be careful not to overlearn the lessons and things that aren't true. Okay? We are still debating what happened in World War I and World War II. Rest assured, we're going to be debating what's happened in this war and why. Defense communities often don't do nuance well, speaking as a member of one. So the pendulum can swing rapidly from seeing the Russian military as being 10 or 12 feet tall to seeing it as being 4 feet tall. I very much discourage the swing, okay? It will lead to bad strategic assumptions and complacency, right? There are all sorts of analogies that one can point to historically where this has not led to good things. For example, terrible Red Army performance during the Winter War of 1939-1940 with Finland. Some countries looked at that performance and they learned things about the problems and challenges in the Red Army that were true, but they also learned things that weren't true about the Red Army. And so here I raise this analogy so as that we don't go from a sense, maybe a sense of overstating the Russian military capability and threat to one that dramatically understates it. You need to have the art of the long view as you kind of look out both into this conflict, but also more importantly onto the future of European security.
Thank you so much. Kori, I wanted to turn to you for a minute. We've seen, actually more than a minute, we've seen Western assistance evolve since the invasion in February. Particularly from the US side, we've seen an expansion of intelligence sharing, a move towards heavier weaponry. Where can Western assistance be more effective?
Well, I think at this point, anything the Ukrainians are asking for, we should give them. Initially, the Biden administration, I think, was hesitant to give some top-of-the-line weapons to Ukraine because their assessment was that Ukraine was going to lose the war. And as confidence grew in the Ukrainian military's capability and the Ukrainian society's toughness, I think you saw a move from we can't put these weapons in Ukrainian hands because then they'll be in Russian hands, to we can't send offensive weapons, we can only send defensive weapons. And the window just keeps expanding as governments realize that Ukraine can win this war. And it's increasingly a war about the end of the Cold War, not simply a war about Ukraine. It's a war about the end of imperial Russian ambitions and finding a way to put Russia in a comfortable place on the European map where they're not a predator to the states on their periphery. So the main things I think we should be giving Ukraine in assistance are actually reassurance about the reconstruction of Ukraine's economy, of Ukraine's physical infrastructure. They're having to blow up their own bridges. And I think the Ukrainian government assessed they'd need, $5 billion a week to be able to stay afloat. We should be making those assurances because anything that keeps Ukraine fighting is not only in Ukraine's interests, it's absolutely in our interests. So I'd put all the weapons they want as the first priority. Second priority is a commitment for the reconstruction of the apartment buildings the Russians have been blowing up, the hospitals the Russians have been blowing up, the bridges Ukrainians have had to blow up themselves in order to keep the Russian army where they wanted it. So all of those things, but those would be my priorities. Also, one thing I should say, I think one of the most extraordinary things about the war is the way civil society in the West has really rallied to Ukraine's support, not just the generosity of Poles and Germans taking in so many refugees into their own homes, but Chef Jose Andres and the World Central Kitchen are running an enormous food campaign inside Poland, inside Russia. And so what we are seeing is the way that civil society is such an important part of the West in general. And facilitating that, I think also, I'm sorry, one thing I also should have mentioned. Francois last night was talking about breaking Russia's ability to prevent Ukraine from exporting grain, from using its own ports. I guess that would be my third priority for assistance, helping open seaborne access to Ukraine.
Thank you. Major Błazeusz, Mike talked a lot about sort of Russian performance in the war. Can you talk about NATO and the national militaries in Europe. What sort of Russian military are we facing? What would be required to defeat it? What have we learned from the conflict in Ukraine for NATO?
Thank you, Sharon, for an easy question. And you just made a mistake because you gave the floor to the general. So anyway, first of all, a quick assessment or recap of things that are maybe obvious to a lot of us, but I think it will set the stage nicely. Russia has unilaterally decided to become a direct threat, not a strategic competitor anymore. And we have to keep that in mind. It was their own conscious choice to do it. We wanted them to be part of our Western society, community, culture. They decided otherwise. Second one, it's ready, willing to violate and alternate, if possible, the existing international order, which and basically contest our laws, rules, and values. The other one is that it also wants to impose forcefully on other nations its own vision of the world. And that's really scary in the 21st century, especially in Europe, that they want to, again, divide the world into the spheres of influence and with complete disregard of the human rights and the right to the self-determination of nations. The other point that I would quickly make about Russia is that, or let me touch briefly on the Belarus. Belarus, as we discussed a little bit last night, it is an integral part of the red bloc, and we have to keep that in mind. This is the truth, and for Poland, for strategic reasons, it causes additional strategic dilemma. They're fully integrated, their command and control system, their militaries, so it's not a separate country. Again, it's a new red bloc, if I may say. We also are witnessing a Russian political corruption in our countries. And what I mean by that is that they're really influencing our public opinion, our politicians, and the way we do business. And we have to be careful about it, identify, and try to counter it. But it's difficult because of our democratic values and the way we operate. Also, as a result of globalization, we all are indirectly financing the Russian regime and its military. Our economies are so interrelated that it's really difficult to cut for the moment, but that should be our goal. So to sum up this part, we are definitely witnessing a permanent change in the nationally established security order. And we see a severe limitations to the whole establishment that was created after World War II to secure the peace in the world. There are such severe limitations, as you know, that it's difficult in any way to force a member of the Security Council to agree on a certain resolutions about what's going on in Ukraine. Now, let me turn a little bit to the Russian military, as asked. First, as what Michael said, we should not be naive that the bear is on its knees. Not all its resources have been employed so far. Yes, it took some scars, it has some wounds, but it still is able to reconstitute, and it's possible quite quickly. And again, keep in mind, in the case of Russia, it's not about the quality, it's more about the quantity. And even though there are 100 tanks destroyed, the other 100, that's maybe not the most modern, could go through because we simply can run out of ammunition. And that sheer mass has been the modus operandi for a long time, as you remember. The other point I want to make is that on one hand, the Russian culture cannot embrace the ingenuity, decentralization, the mission command, looking after your own troops, and, for example, the NCO role. However, on the other hand, as the history is showing, if they are ordered or they are pressed against the wall, they can learn and adjust as they did in World War II, right? 45, and to the point that was mentioned before, in 45 they were in Berlin, despite all the setbacks that were mentioned here, and also after Georgia, they started to adjust. They were not successful to the extent we thought. And really, last few points, what we should do with all the instruments of power that are in our position. First of all, as was mentioned by the Prime Minister, it's about the unity, cohesion, solidarity, and speaking with one voice. And basically, we must make sure that our actions that we are taking and will take in the future discourage Russia from further actions and leave no doubt or interpretation in their minds about our intent. Because as we'll mention here also, unfortunately, because of the differences in culture and values and the perception of the world, the dialogue is perceived as a weakness on the other side. This is something common on us. We always discuss. We can reconcile after wars. It's not, unfortunately, in the mentality. So that's one point. We need to maintain our public support in our societies, and we need to continue improving our decision-making process. We need to design the right strategies, and the NATO strategic concept is one that's coming online very soon. We need to make sure that we properly identify the threat and our political objectives and somehow define this victory that was mentioned. What do we mean by victory? And what we would consider a victory over Russia, which is not an easy, and again, this is mostly political level, while we as the military will make that or define the tools we need as the military instrument of power to make it happen. Then we need to continue expanding our capabilities, and the ones that are, in my opinion, the most important and are proving right now in Ukraine, intel. Intel, including indications and warnings, but also the whole source of targeting, long-range precision strike, command and control system, the communication systems, cyber and space. Those are domains. The war is ongoing as we speak. Space is slowly catching up with the cyber as well. We need to top it with a really strong stratcom, not the Russian-style propaganda, and also we need to top it with the information warfare. And think in an innovative way and really embrace on all the emerging and disruptive technologies, because that would give us an advantage. We have to be as much proactive as possible, because so far we as the West have been rather reactive to what the other side was doing. And as was mentioned, deterrence by denial, not deterrence by punishment, and the forward presence. The other side understands only the power, the strength, and that's something that we should look into and kind of rethink and make it and go back to the some of the old designs, but more modern. So to sum up, Russia is a long-term problem set for all of us, for all of our countries, and requires strategic patience and perseverance. We must use this strategic pause that we have right now, thanks to the brave Ukraine who is putting the fight, to prepare for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to pick up on one thing you said about what do we mean by victory over Russia, and turn to Alina. What does that mean for Ukraine? What is the end game? What does victory mean in this current situation?
Good morning, everyone. First of all, just using this opportunity, I would like to thank to all the Polish nation, because that's fantastic and incredible, and for Ukrainian it means a lot, believe me. What do we mean when we say victory? Yes, and this is an extremely principled question, because most of Ukrainian, just general public, sees this as like a movie of the Second World War. You know, when tanks and army is going to the border and winning the border, and that's the end. But that's not the end. I have no doubts that we will release the whole territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, because we have this chance now. But that's not the end, obviously, and we're really in the hybrid war, which happened to be more conventional than many people expected, but still it's a hybrid. We will have missiles attacks for years. We will have border provocations for years. We will have still many political oppression for years, and not only Ukraine. I think that we need, when we plan the victory, we need to think about all this stuff and think very carefully. And I think that yesterday we a little bit touched this question. I think that the whole victory will come when we will be sure that Russia has no control over Ukraine. Russia has no great influence over European politicians and economy. And when we will see absolutely free Black and Azov Sea region, and this is principal issue, because this is projects now on security, and the war actually started from there in Georgia, in Ukraine, 2014, and it should be end up there because the prevailing of international law should be clearly set in the maritime domain also, which we like are fully not discussing yet and didn't start. But for me, the principal issue is also how it happened. I mean that there were many discussions, there were many strategies put in place, but when the situation started, no one was ready. In Western world, no one was ready. No one has a plan for the situation. We discussed the Russian intentions for years. We listened for Putin's speeches, where he absolutely openly proclaimed everything what he will do. We saw the escalation of the last year near Ukrainian borders. We got the intelligence and alarms coming out from intelligence of many countries, but no one was ready, and there were no plan. And that was the most impressive, that it took almost 2 months for the whole Western world to deliver some short-range strategy for now. And this is the question to those strategies, to all of us sitting here, how it happened and what we should do, not let it happen again. Because actually the situation which we have now, this is complete copy-paste of the Second World War. I mean, how it started. So, all the international institutions from now on demonstrated it's like at least low capability, if not to say worse. UN absolutely cannot influence the situation. Red Cross was absent for 2 months in Ukraine and just collecting money without providing any help. And we have a long list of questions to the international community and to security, which Ukraine absolutely put also to ourselves. How we let it happen in such a way that we didn't put enough efforts into reformation, into the alarming, into the saying all the necessary words and put all the necessary actions before it. So this is not only a question to Western countries, this is also the question to Ukraine, who didn't put enough efforts in it. But I think that this is like a very serious issues which we need to start to, not simply to consider, but start to do already some actions. And this would be a victory if we will put the system which will allow nations to feel safe, and which will allow nations to, I don't know, to make this slogan "Never Again" like a realistic one, because it was like this 8th of March. It looks a little bit funny from Ukraine, to listen "Never Again" all around the world when all these things happening now, and. I think that many Western countries, unfortunately, they live for a long period without threat. Unfortunately, because it just allows them to feel a little bit reluctant about everything they do. And many of European politicians till now don't feel this threat. And we still see some claims of that Ukraine should reject part of its sovereignty to let the Putin keep its face. Well, I don't know which face we would like to see. If this is the face we would like to see in international politics, influencing international politics, this is obviously not the system which will let the values and victory happen. For Ukraine, this is extremely painful experience, but that's extremely good experience. I mean, our nation was for many years was perceived by Ukrainians and by many others as the nation of all the time suffering from occupation, suffering from Holodomor, suffering from losing the independence. And many people grow up in this like a framework, many people in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. From now on, our kids live in framework that no one can deal with Ukraine in that way. I mean that our kids will grow up in understand that Ukraine is strongest nation in the world, and this has absolutely changed perception of Ukrainians of everything what's going on. But this also changed the security infrastructure in Europe and in the world, because Ukraine is a huge nation, big European nation. Ukraine is a Black Sea nation which influenced the security. Ukraine will take active part, dependent of the how long this war will take, how serious the economic troubles will be. Ukraine will be a big player. And Ukraine is the young nation with tough character, with the many reasons behind to be like a quite vocal for now. And I think that Europe should take this into consideration. I think that all the strategies depend less of are we the member state of NATO or not, should include the Ukrainian capability to be a European nation. And as for NATO, as for strategy of NATO for 2000, for the next like a decade, which should be adopted soon, I hope that it will include all these things inside. And I hope, because the previous version, which we just like been discussing last autumn, was absolutely not facing the reality, let's say so. Even seeing all the troops on the borders, that version was not facing the reality. And I absolutely agree with the phrase which Prime Minister said here, that not enough to win the war, we must not lose a peace. And this is the task. We live in fascinating time, very difficult time, but this is the task for this generation of politics and military, to make the system which will allow us not to lose the peace, and to understand finally that if you have enemy, and you should operate like having an enemy on the border. And to stop for look for some similarities, because there is no similarities in positions, there is no similarities in values, and we always should have a plan B. And this is the system which should be built up, that the system which should provide us ability to be prosperous, but always have a plan B. And for me, that would be a victory.
Thank you. So I wanted to turn to the panel with some follow-up questions. The Prime Minister had this nice quote about strategy is about winning. And we've seen from the US perspective an evolution from the debates over lethal aid, offensive versus defensive weaponry. But we are still seeing some limits on what the US administration will provide for Ukraine. When it comes to intelligence sharing, it's expanded, but still not intelligence targets within Russia. There was some talk, I think it was last week, on providing multiple launch rocket system for Ukraine, but there also still appear to be some concerns about providing weaponry that could, for instance, target inside Russia. Is it possible to have victory while still having these sort of lines that the U.S. and the West is drawing on helping Ukraine? And that could be for whoever wants to address it.
Another easy question, thank you. Well, I think we should start with maybe revising our definitions of what's offensive and defensive. I believe they're a little bit outdated nowadays, and cyber is the best example. We should rather look at the purpose on how we want to employ those weapons, for what purpose, instead of trying to say that aircraft is an offensive weapon, not really an offensive. That's one challenge, I think, that we are stuck a little bit on these discussions, as you mentioned, instead of trying to look forward and really support the Ukrainians as much as possible India fight for freedom, for self-determination, and the right to choose, something that unfortunately the invader wants to deny. And about targeting some targets in Russia, it's tricky in a way that so far Russia did not invoke the state of war. It's probably doing some limited secret mobilization, but still so far it did not employ all of its resources. So now if, and this is my personal opinion, if Ukraine decides to attack even more targets in Russia, that might give them the reason to go fully into the war system. The other challenge is that we have to keep in mind that if there is a decision that certain part of the Ukraine that have been annexed illegally are announced to be part of Russia, then Ukrainian forces trying to retake, rightly so, those parts, which illegally were announced a part of Russia, then the question is, are they now fighting or crossing the territory of Russia, even though legally, according to the law, it's not Russia. So to sum up, I think we should provide all sorts of lethal, non-lethal aid for our Ukrainian brothers, neighbors, members of the European community who wanted for a long time to become officially part of it, but for a number of political reasons it was not possible, because they are fighting for us. For the moment, we are not, we do not have to send our troops to fight there. So we definitely should support them as much as possible, continue doing what we're doing, and not to worry, or take risks, I should say, because every nation that's providing the aid, the support, the weaponry to Ukraine is obviously taking some risks. But it's worth taking, and again, we are now getting, as I said, a strategic pause, because the worst that would come up out of this war is that it will not be a frozen conflict, it will be a permanent crisis. And are we ready for this protracted permanent crisis and atrocities that may continue for a long time? Thank you.
So the Biden administration has stressed early and repeatedly the limits of American involvement that they want to preserve. They want Ukraine to win the war. They also don't want the war to spread to Poland or Romania or escalate to involve the United States or NATO more broadly. And it's not terrific strategy to emphasize to your adversary what you won't do. But they're not wrong to want to limit the war in the ways that they can, to assist Ukrainian victory, to assist Russian failure, but to prevent the war spreading. And so there are very clear limits on American involvement, but the line has been moving, as the general said, as we became more confident that Ukraine was willing to fight with such tenacity, as we realized to, I think, almost everybody's surprise, how deficient the Russian military is and how much they are struggling to do things of basic proficiency in military operations. That's caused for expansion. I mean, Secretary of Defense said a week or so ago that we not only want a Ukrainian victory, we want to prevent the Russians from having the ability to do this again, which is an expanded war aim. And I think states, when you are succeeding in combat, there's always a tendency to expand what you think you can gain from the victory in the war. And I think we're seeing a lot of that going on right now.
Mike, I wasn't sure if you wanted to address.
Well, it's hard to follow, Kori, but maybe I just briefly add that Strategy is fundamentally about choices. It most reveals itself in what you choose to do, but especially in what you choose not to do. And in it, it has a theory of action, a theory of victory. And strategy also has to be adaptable to the choices of adversaries. Hence, to some extent, it's an interaction between you and opponent. I think Kori's quite right. Both as we become more confident of Ukrainian success, but also confident of the ability to manage escalation in providing support at the same time, it's led to this evolution, right, in what the United States is doing. The other thing I would say to the general's great comments is defensive and offensive weapons are a political characterization. Military analysts like myself, which sometimes are the knuckle draggers of the community, don't see generally such distinctions. In most cases, there are no practical distinctions between offensive or defensive weapons. Operationally, they're valid for both cases, right? So these tend to be political characterizations, and defensive weapons often end up being the things you want to provide, and offensive weapons may be the things you chose that you don't want to provide, whereas fundamentally they have the same roles. That's the only thing I'll add to that conversation.
Just a small add-in. From practical point of view, yes, we need the heavy artillery and we need the fighter jets, but we also need the air defense system, and this is the key question now for economy saving. I mean, that Ukraine is ready to start recovery even in the situation of war, but we cannot do it without the air defense system. And this is the next question. No one says no, but no one makes a principled decision on this. And this is the issue. And yes, you're absolutely right that the readiness to support changed because in the beginning it was like a, great feeling of that they don't let you to die, but they don't let you to win. That was the feeling on the battlefield, exactly. Now we understand that everyone believed in the Ukrainian victory and started to invest in it. But this is not time for like a small investment. We need the big one. And then we promised that we will keep the enemy on the border. But we need it now. And this is the key issue and key question.
Thank you. We heard a lot of talk about Russia's plan A of taking Kiev quickly, not working and moving to a plan B. Where is Russia now in its goals for the war? Is it still in this plan B? What are they trying to achieve at this point?
I'll try to take that on first. So it's clear that they tried to at least revise initial war aims after the complete failure of their main operation to focus on the Donbass, right? And originally they started with a larger envelopment. That hasn't worked out for them either, both because of very stiff and effective Ukrainian resistance, also because they don't really have the forces for that kind of operation left anymore. Russian casualties are pretty immense. They're, in the first month and a half of the war, probably larger than both Chechen wars combined. And that's very significant. But also I want to highlight that this is an adversary that's sustaining the fight and sustaining an offensive despite these casualties as well. And as a conversation about the potential staying power of Russian military in this war. Now they're focused on the Severodonetsk and northeastern part of the Donbass. The offensive appears to be in part stalled, but it has not run out of steam yet. But I think over time, Russian forces are becoming exhausted and combat ineffective. So now it's a function of time before the Russian military is ultimately put to a choice, or more accurately, the political leadership. What are they going to do? They will not be able to sustain the war the way they're fighting now and with the force availability and the structure that they have. They made big choices in how they organized their military after the reforms. Those choices had big assumptions, and like all militaries, they made trade-offs. And some of those trade-offs have now come to bite. There's variable lessons here, not just about the Russian military, but to some extent even for defense military community organizations here in the West. I mean, the way we debate force design. So with that in mind, the political leadership is going to have to try to figure out how they're going to change their manpower shortage, if they're going to enact partial mobilization, if they're going to actually declare a state of war, if they're going to employ more conscripts, if they're going to make very politically risky choices. But that's the reality for them right now. They have options to drag out this war. It may not fundamentally alter Russians' fortunes in the conflict. It can just make it a longer war. And that's one of the things that I want to make as a sobering assessment, right? That oftentimes when you look at a war, you don't know if you're sort of near the beginning, the middle, or the end. Maybe it's fair to say that we're past the beginning, but how long this conflict can go on is very difficult to predict. And I often get yelled at for saying this, but there's few things as contingent as war. And another thing I'll add is, to some people that believe, looking back now on the first months, that a lot of this was overdetermined, that it was going to turn out this way. I'm going to tell you that's not the case. This was highly contingent. And we may down the line find out that the opening phase of this war, despite all the Russian mistakes, despite problems at tactical level proficiency and the like, was much more a closer run thing than we would like to believe. So that's the truth of it.
Just a few more comments from my side. First of all, I think no one has a doubt that they have developed the plan to invade Ukraine for a long time, and they were preparing for this plan for a long time too, knowing the potential consequences. Probably the extent of the consequences has surprised them, but definitely they were preparing the economy, they were preparing their internal communication systems, banking systems. So there was a whole of government approach to prepare for this particular invasion. We just, most of us just could not believe that they will make that decision to actually physically invade an independent country. One thing is bullying, threatening, doing all sorts of hybrid warfare. The other one is going in force and indiscriminately attacking the civilians, killing them, not following any of the conventions that we try to always follow during the war. With the Russians, I think there is no doubt there is a total disregard for the human losses among their troops. They absolutely do not take care for their troops. That's why morale is going down, and that's a serious issue. They also don't care for the number of equipment they lose that much, because they have still large stocks. Yes, it's not the most modern equipment, and we see employment on an old systems right now, but the sheer mass is still there. And as I said, we may have, and I say we, meaning all of us, the most modern systems, but we have stocks of those systems. And we can, again, as I said, destroy, let's say, 100 tanks and use all of our most modern weapon, while these extra 100 tanks, the old ones, will still make it through. And that's what's unfortunately possible. So we have to face that. And yes, they have a challenge with the sustainability, but they are trying to adjust their logistics as we speak. And they can do it in a way that in our societies are not that easy, because they can just order private companies to provide what's needed in means of mobility, transportability. And the worst thing that is still on the table is all sorts of provocation, false flag attacks, and then blaming, as they are blaming the Ukrainians right now for those attacks, that potentially may force them to use what we all know, that they may make that decision to escalate, as we all know, in order to de-escalate. This is the Russian doctrine. So it's possible. It's highly unlikely, I think, but they will make their own calculus and they will make the decision. So there is a possibility of use of the tactical nuclear weapons still on the table. They have them. They are a nuclear power, but we just hope that they will not go that far. Thank you.
I wanted to pick up on that question because we also have that from the virtual world of questions. The potential use, there have been a lot of concerns expressed along the way about the potential of Russia using whether a chemical weapon or a tactical nuclear weapon. What are the options for a Western response to that? I don't think anyone can imagine that the West would respond with a nuclear response. So what are the options?
So,
Go ahead, Kori.
So I think it's really important that we not wait until Russia make that decision in order to respond. That there are things we can and should be doing now in order to change Russia's potential decision calculus on that. First and foremost, given the penetration of Russian high policy levels and military communications by the intelligence organizations in the West, the first thing is we should be conveying to the Russians that if we see mobilization, if we see tactical preparations, if we see policy debates in that regard, that we will intervene to try and prevent it. I think it's really important for the Russians to also have to face the risk of escalation. And an escalation that we can and should be threatening is that if we get any sense the Russians are willing to cross the nuclear threshold, that we will become combatants in the war on Ukraine's side. I think that's really important. I think it's really important we suggest that we will prevent the use, even including operations on Russian territory, if we see preparations for nuclear use. And third, that we will pull Ukraine further and faster into the West, which presumably the prevention of which was one of Russia's war aims. That is, if Russia crosses that threshold, and for example, one scenario that I think is plausible for Russian nuclear use is as they lose the conventional war, in order to cover the humiliation of their retreat, I could see them using it in a demonstrative way, attacking a Ukrainian city in order for Russia to be able to pretend to its own people that it didn't lose the war and have to slink away in humiliation, that it achieved its objectives. And so I really think it's important early, privately, and publicly to raise the cost to the Russians of crossing that threshold.
Thank you for these words. I do believe that it should be like this, except one issue that NATO issue, yes. So we see that in the situation in the world, like Russia, it made it, only collective defense means. And we shouldn't discuss anymore the Ukraine and NATO in the position from the Russian point of view, that if Russia will behave or not behave, then we will consider or not consider. I think that in case of the threat of nuclear weapon, I'm absolutely agree with you. And the best case in this scenario is like immediately to make the Ukraine the NATO member, and it will mean already that it will be a usage of the NATO forces on Ukrainian territory. In case if Russia won't make this preparation, Ukraine should be in NATO immediately after the end up of conventional warfare on its territory, because this is the only guarantee of the that we won't see the next round of the war in the next few years. Because even if Russia will suffer from economical losses, even if Russia will suffer from many losses in this war, I'm absolutely agree with you that they still have a lot of weapons, they still have a lot of missiles, and only collective defense can play against. We still can make the view that we live in the world which we lived before, but that's not. The world completely changed. And if we want to have some kind of umbrella, security umbrella over the Europe, well, there is no any other choice. And plus, I make a bet with our military guys that they end up this war till the end of the year, and I promise them next year we will be in NATO. So I need to win it.
Quick comment. Absolutely agree with Kori. We need to continue using this strategy of disclosing the intents of the other side. The US has been doing an extremely good job on this one, and I think preventing some of the possibilities of implementing things that the other side was planning. The other one, yes, Kori, you're like a general. We need to play those scenarios. We need to do little wargaming and just be prepared as much as possible for such case, and just hope that it never happens. That's what always military does. The other point, we cannot also completely rule out the possibility that there will be, let's call it, an incident or accident in one of the Ukrainian nuclear plants or in one of the Ukrainian chemical ammonium production chlorine plants. That's also a challenge, and then obviously the other side will absolutely, as usually, deny any involvement. So that's another potential little hybrid scenario that we have to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. We've spoken a lot about the Russian military and what it's experienced and some of its failures. Can we talk a little bit about what the Ukraine military has learned from these months of war? I think it was recently President Zelensky replaced the head of the Ukraine Territorial Defense Forces. What have they learned? What progress still needs to be made?
Well, I'm not General Zaluzhny, and I'm not in charge of the Ukrainian armed forces, but I think Ukrainian armed forces have progressed significantly since 2014, and we see the effects of this transformation, which was not completed and is not completed, on the battlefield. And one example is what the Ukrainian NCOs are doing on the battlefield. On the other side, if you eliminate the commander, the commandeer, they go often into the disarray. So that's one example. The other one, look at this pace that the Ukrainian armed forces are learning to operate very modern Western equipment. This is really amazing and impressive that these young people come, learn how to operate the equipment that we are donating and then providing to them, and they utilize it and employ it very effectively. And we've seen it at the Donetsk river crossing that the other side was attempting. So we need to continue supporting. NATO has been doing a little bit in this area through its programs, but right now it's the moment that we definitely need to continue, I may say, investing in the Ukrainian armed forces, pick up the pace, and then help them out even more. So I'm really impressed with the performance. And again, keep in mind, even though we see mostly territorial defense, the operational forces are doing their part as well, for sure. And so far, they're inflicting heavy losses on the other side, and there are some local wins, and we keep fingers crossed that the Ukrainian armed forces will keep beating the red, because red is bad. Thank you.
Can I come back for a moment to this operation which you mentioned in Seversky Donetsk, when just in one day Russian losses more than 1,000 officers and soldiers and 70 plus pieces of the equipment and weapon. So that was like a very good example of how you can use the modern weapon and non-standard approach, because actually what plays well, this is that our software guys who are now in the armed forces, they created a software which allowed them to have a decentralized artillery targeting. And this is tactics which gave no possibility for Russian to identify the artillery positions. And that was like an extremely marvelous operation of the modern contemporary war. And I think that's like a perfect example why Western countries should be quite interested in investing in Ukraine now. Because yes, we have a massive destruction of our defense industry, but we do have intelligence, we do have intellectual power, we do have engineering, we do have a lot of people with practical experience on battlefield who know what you need in all these consequences, and who can provide extremely good and light solutions and cheap solutions for this situation. And combination of this knowledge and combination of the ability of investment can just blow up the defense industry in Europe, and not only in Europe. So think about this is good investment opportunity for now.
So maybe if I could add, I think Ukraine's done a phenomenal job combining small squad tactics particularly in urban terrain, with really great demonstrated prowess in artillery. This is in many ways an artillery war, more than not. It may not look that way on TikTok and Twitter, but artillery has done most of the damage and inflicted most of the casualties and has stopped a lot of Russian advances. Ukraine also adapted quite well, understanding early on that the weakness of the initial Russian attack was logistics. The three-front attack with many axes of advance for which Russian troops were not prepared and weren't well organized had major problems, and one of them is that the Russian military is logistically not set up for that kind of operation. That being said, in terms of adaptation, I think one of the biggest things this war at the end of the day shows is big conventional wars do come down over time to manpower and material, and attrition is a big factor, right? That's just the reality of it. Beyond the initial operations, beyond the initial concepts of operations, things often go wrong. And so I think the biggest success we've probably had over time is being able to effectively resource the Ukrainian military and also support the Ukrainian military in a number of different ways, because this does come down to equipment. It does come down to ammunition. A war that is centered around artillery is a war that's going to be logistics heavy and ammunition heavy. That's why it's critical for Ukraine to begin shifting off of Soviet ammunition calibers and onto NATO standard ones that we can actually provide, right? Because you're not going to be able to find these kind of munitions around Europe for much longer. Beyond that, I'd say really effective use of modern means of ISR, drones and the like, commercial off-the-shelf platforms integrated with conventional Soviet artillery, because you really just have tremendous increase of lethality on the battlefield. And the biggest change you see on the contemporary battlefield is the proliferation of cheap sensors, the fact that it's very hard to hide, incredibly hard to hide. And of course, the side that's on the offense is the side that actually has to concentrate, so it actually is much more vulnerable to artillery. All right, all that being equal, and the tremendous sort of motivation within Ukrainian armed forces and their effective implementation, I guess what we might call mission command, although there's still a lot of things I think we have to learn about how this war has progressed that we'll have to go back and revise. Sorry, I'm just going to tell you up front that some of the things we know about this war early on probably are not right, and we'll have to revise that record over time. Just be prepared for it. And especially most of the takes or hot takes you see on Twitter are probably wrong, just being frank on that score. That said, offensive operations and combined arms maneuver is going to be one of the next biggest challenges for the Ukrainian military. Effectively organizing that, effectively resourcing that to actually take back territory. Because yes, at some point, the Russian offensive is clearly going to run out of steam. It's petering out already from, I think, what we can see. That's a fair assessment. And the Ukrainian military, to take back territory, is going to have to take the fight to Russian forces, where they'll be on the defense. And that's, from my point of view, the next big challenge of that fight. Yes, the Ukrainian military has demonstrated that they can take back territory around Kharkiv and other places, where there's a very low density of Russian forces and where Russian forces engage in a tactical retreat. But as is very clear, Russian forces are not going to be doing that across the rest of the battlefield when it comes down to it, to the Donbass. And so folks have to be prepared, I think, for the fact that this is going to be a tough battle and a sustained fight, at least over the course of the coming months. And well, I already said it's difficult to predict how long a war like this can go on. That's why I always encourage focusing on things like resourcing, on ammunition, on conventional weapons, and assuming it's going to be a longer war, rather than assuming that sort of victory is at hand.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from the virtual world and combine it with one of mine. How are Russian losses in the prolonged war in Ukraine affecting Russia's ability to wage a larger war against NATO? And related to that, what we talked about yesterday privately was, what is Russia's ability to reconstitute its forces from its recent losses?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll take this on. I apologize if I'm speaking in a row, but I'd like to grab this one if I can. So the Russian military is fighting at peacetime strength. It's a military that's designed to generate some of its maneuver potential from its forces, but depends on partial mobilization. And it was built out this way that in the event of a sort of big war in Europe, a war would be declared, they would have access to greater manpower, the units would be brought up to full strength. Most of the active force of the Russian military at this point is tapped out. They've sent in what reinforcements they can, and there aren't forces or units back in Russia to rotate the current formations that are in the fight and replace them, all right? So they have huge challenges in terms of staining this conflict right now. And I think that paints a clear picture of what Russia's potential is for any other military operation right now in Europe, just to be perfectly honest. The entirety of Russian ground forces and most of the military is engaged in this war, and it's clearly not winning. That being said, if we look at the losses, so casualty figures are debated. Let's put it this way: they're quite high, and the total casualties, because folks focus on those killed in combat, but if you do the math out, the total casualties are tremendous relative what going to be the actual number of personnel killed. The material losses, well, maybe they've lost about 15 to 20% of the active force when it comes to tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Is quite significant. It will impose material constraints. But there's a good debate to be had about how long it will take the Russian military to reconstitute itself. So here, on this score, I'm very uncertain. I actually suspect the Russian military, in terms of material, could replenish those losses a lot faster than people think. I think the biggest damage is to the force and to the actual quality of the force. It'll take a while for that force to recover. But folks may be very surprised if they assume that this is going to set the Russian military back by a generation or generations. Past conflicts and past defeats have shown Russian ability to reconstitute themselves relatively quicker and quicker than you may expect. Of course, much depends on the impact of sanctions, and so the impact of sanctions on Russia's defense industrial complex. But that is also an untested hypothesis, right? We don't know yet what that impact will be. A lot of people, I think, to some extent would want to wishfully paint the story forward, and the truth is we just don't know what the impact and implications will be yet, right? And I just want to be frank on that there's a lot of uncertainty and unknowns there. So I think from my point of view, the safest assumption, or at least the smartest assumption, if we are going to have a strategic conversation, is first, to assume that the Russian military is going to reconstitute itself, that it's going to conduct reforms, that we'll be able to replace material losses, especially the equipment that's easy to replace, like ground force equipment. Most of the capabilities, to be frank, that concern NATO were not lost in this war, or not even used. Integrated air defense, electronic warfare, counterspace, cyber capabilities, Russia's undersea capabilities, and the like. Much of the Russian Air Force, the losses are significant, but at the end of the day, maybe I'll be blunt here. The Russian Air Force, from my point of view, is maybe at least a generation still behind counterpart Western Air Forces. I'm not sure that's what was really keeping people up at night. So just to be frank on that, a lot of the capabilities that were most concerning from the standpoint of some of these scenarios are not things that Russia has lost or has not lost in significant amounts, and how long it'll take them to replace it is unfortunately an open-ended question.
Maybe I'll say something about the reconstitution of the non-military parts of Russian power, because at the start of the war, there was so much excitement over the sanctions packages that Western countries were putting into play. And I think one of the surprises is that they haven't been more effective than they have been. Now, granted, sanctions accrue, the effect of sanctions accrues over time, but as long as we are still buying Russian oil and gas, there are real limits on the effectiveness of economic sanctions. What has been surprising to me is the extent to which Russia is willing to damage its own long-term market access for oil and gas. I mean, the cutting off of gas to Poland and Romania, the threat to do it to Finland as Finland applies for NATO membership. Once countries find alternative sources of energy, they're not, and once the Russians have demonstrated they're willing to weaponize their economic tools, it's going to be very hard for them to win those markets back. That will have long-term effect on prices. It'll have long-term effect on market access. That is where countries and companies are willing to make long-term energy contracts. So it's surprising the extent to which Russia's actually damaging its own ability to reconstitute its political and economic status from before the war.
Very briefly, please think for a moment about World War II, Leningrad, Stalingrad, the sufferings that the whole society was willing to take to defend those two cities, which are symbolic cities. I'm saying this because Russia is used to enduring all sorts of suffering. And again, that's why they quite often refer to the great defense of the motherland, the great patriotic war in World War II. Think about Stalin sending sappers to demine the minefield just to spare the tanks. So when we try to judge the ability to reconstitute, we should definitely not use our Western lenses or our Western standards. We have to kind of a little bit step back and apply how they see that. And as Michael has mentioned, they have the ability to reconstitute. We have this strategic pause right now, and hard to assess if it's going to last half a year, maybe 2 years. But do not be deceived or naive. As I said, that the bear is almost laying on the floor. Again, in their case, it's about the quantity, not the quality. Total disregard for the welfare of their soldiers. A lot of them, as you know, died not because they are shot, they're killed in action. A lot of them die because there's no medical support, no evacuation. Something that's common for us. They leave the bodies behind. They don't even pick up their own soldiers that are dead. You heard about this mobile crematories, right? Terrible thing. Who in the world would come up with a mobile crematory to limit, obviously, the number of its own bodies going back home, but also to try to hide the war crimes that are committed. So I think they have the ability to reconstitute. Yes, they may have a little challenge with the population, but there is also a reason why they forcefully moved over 1 million Ukrainians to Russia, and will try to integrate them somehow into their own society eventually. But, as Michael mentioned, they still have a number of people they can draft, a number of reserves that they can pull in. So if they decide to go into the full mobilization, they still have a lot of stocks with an old equipment, but hey, it's still shooting. It still can inflict some damage. So to sum up, let's not think that the Russian bear is not able to reconstitute. We need to continue applying the pressure and have a strategic patience. And again, do not underestimate their ability to reconstitute. Thank you.
Oh, please go ahead.
One just small comment for what the Kori said. About the markets, yes, why they do like this, because they do not take this as a market. They never applied the economic logic behind the gas or oil, as well as any other. For them, this is just like a part of the weaponry they use. And you saw that they provided, for example, gas with great discounts for Ukraine or some European countries, which they want to keep in there. So it was economic losses, but they don't care. I mean, and I absolutely support the general. We need to stop to evaluate their actions from the Western point of view, from the values of West. We need to step back and to be in their shoes and to understand that, okay, you will never think that North Korea will just like take care about the lives of their people. Why you think that Russia will take care? They still have millions of kids, including who are now on this hidden mobilization starting from 14 years. So that's something which they will use.
Yeah, if I just very briefly kind of restrike the target, 2 points. One, Russia does not have a mass mobilization basis army. So while it cannot conduct full mobilization, it can implement piecemeal measures, and I want to make a point clear. The size of the Russian military in terms of end strength fighting in Ukraine isn't that large, and Russia has a very large pool available of manpower with recent military experience. If they recruit something like 40, 50,000 additional personnel, they can begin substantially replenishing their forces and rotating them. I just want to make that clear. They can find ways to drag out this conflict. That's the important point. And the second one, defense, right? At the end of the day, it's important not to think with a European defense budget. Russia's a country that spends 4% of GDP in military expenditure. A third of that goes to procurement. In purchasing power parity, that third is 50 to 60 billion at times. It's a very large budget. And at peak times in 2015, they were actually spending more than that, towards 5%. And if they have to spend on defense to cut back on everything else, they will, and they've consistently shown that they will, and that the people will tolerate it, in part because nobody's going to ask them, right? And so you should expect that, yes, they will increase spending on defense. They will try to recapitalize forces. The two big questions we have are, first, they have considerable dependency on foreign components for machine tools and for electronics. Right? They are not as autarkic as they seem as a defense sector. It remains to be seen what the implications are. One, over time, they may become uncompetitive relative to our technology and capabilities, assuming we buy them and actually deploy them in mass. That's also a question for us to ask ourselves. And second, they may not be able to serially produce some of the more advanced capabilities that they're making now, and replace, let's say, the long-range precision-guided weapons they've been using. That, too, I think, could prove very advantageous over time. But all that remains to be seen, right? And so this is a situation where you have to assume that they will find some way to muddle through, even though it will substantially maybe lengthen their procurement cycles and so on and so forth. And if you look at some of the time gaps between situations not like this, but let's say the Russian defeat in 1996 in Chechnya and the Kosovo Accords. Well, the amount of time it took Russia to conduct piecemeal reforms to stabilize the force and reinvade Chechnya was 3 years. Okay? The time gap between the Russia-Georgia war in 2008 and substantial reforms in Russian military and first invasion of Ukraine to 2014, less than 6. The main piece of Russian military modernization program ran from 2011, peaked to 2015, 2016. So recapitalization of a lot of the Russian armed forces took about 5-6 years. Okay? And that's the reason why I'm saying we should be cautious when folks say it'll take a generation or two to recover. I'm skeptical.
We have time for one question from the audience. I don't know if they're passing out a microphone. You want to pick? Who's raising? Okay, I think a gentleman back there raised their hand first. Yes, you.
Thank you very much, Steve Erlanger, New York Times. This has been an excellent but rather one-sided discussion. Could we talk about Ukrainian losses? What is the nature of Ukrainian losses? What are the pressures on the Ukrainian army, which is not that big? That would be really instructive insofar as we actually know. Thank you.
Ukrainian command keep the losses hidden, which is right. I mean, we need to somehow support the morality of the nation, and that would be quite painful story for all of us. But we perfectly understand where we have losses and why we have them. So we were not well prepared from the point of view of weaponry. Obviously, we didn't complete the naval component at all. We lost too much time in the Black Sea and for restoring our naval component. We were not well prepared from the command and control system, which was just like a completely started modernization less than half a year before the war. We have substantial delays with the territorial defense establishment and this total defense approach, which actually was started just a few months before the war. So let's say we lost few substantial years, which can play a lot for modernization in some period. And all the people involved, procurement system, for example, yes, it was stolen. The reform of procurement system was freezed for some period before the war. And for the last few years, we have a substantial gap in procurement. We have to compensate all this now with the bravery and with the losses among our armed forces. And we do understand that we pay a lot. The more we pay with the civilian lives, I expect that the civilian losses will be just like when we can calculate them. Afterwards, they will be huge, especially taking into account Mariupol, Kherson, which is now no one pay attention to from the international media, but things which started to happen there means that we will discover huge number of civilian losses. Losses of those people who were deported to Russia and disappear there. We have around more than 120,000 kids stolen and deported to Russia. We have infiltration camps now. I won't tell you what's happening there because you cannot imagine this to be in this reality. I have half of my team originated from Mariupol. And I won't tell you what efforts we did to take out their relatives and parents from infiltration camps. And that's some kind of extremely parallel realities, you know. You live in two worlds simultaneously. One is with coffee on the streets and ability to participate in the conference, and another with the attempt to save people from some ugly places, which could never happen and should never happen again. So Ukraine is paying with huge losses for its mistakes. And I hope that it will be also lessons learned for politicians in Ukraine, how to modernize and how not to let it happen again, and how to make it more contemporary. And I'm extremely grateful to General Zaluzhny and to all the military management, now leadership, who is like doing all the kind of reforms during the war, who is applying the new approaches during the war. And this is the extremely difficult task.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, and particularly thank you, Alina, because I think of all of us, you probably had the longest journey here coming from Kiev, so we appreciate that. Thank you again.